Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining this Global Investigative Journalism Network webinar, which is about investigating war crimes. My name is Dennis Jidic, and I'm the Executive Director of the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a specialized media outlet which is focused on reporting about the Bosnian War in the early 90s and the legacies of that war today. And I have the pleasure of moderating this webinar. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and much more recently the war between Israel and Hamas are two conflicts that are in the news very, very much. But violent conflicts continue around the world in Syria and Sudan and Yemen and Afghanistan, Myanmar, in Mexico, even in many other places around the world. There are more than 100 armed conflicts and wars taking place around the world today. The crimes committed in these conflicts demand accountability. And journalists have a critical role in reporting and investigating war crimes and conflict in general. The Global Investigative Journalism Network has worked with investigative journalists, with war correspondents, with lawyers, legal experts, human rights experts, and recently published its new Reporter's Guide on Investigating War Crimes. Now, this guide looks to shine a light of the practices of those who wage war, and it has really concrete tips on how to find evidence, how to report, how to expose propaganda, and to show what's really going on the ground. So reporting and investigating war and conflict are critical, but as Ukrainian investigative journalist and contributor to the guide, Valentyna Samar notes, it's really impossible to write professionally about the war without basic understanding of the laws and customs of that war. So in this webinar, what we intend to do is to share methodologies for investigating war and conflict and provide a briefing on the laws that govern what we call war crimes in popular language. Now, as you will hear, that term is a bit difficult and sometimes doesn't cover everything we tend to explain with the words war crimes. This is not to say that journalists should or can be lawyers, and it's not the job of journalists to take over the entire process of accountability. However, understanding the key concepts of international humanitarian law can go a long way in improving the quality of reporting and in the long run even assist accountability efforts. Now, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. All of them are authors of the Global Investigative Journalism Network Guide to Investigating War Crimes. I will introduce them in the order they will speak. The introduction will be short because their work really speaks for themselves, and I'm sure many of you have already heard and are amazed by what they're doing. First of all, we'll have Claire Simmons, who is a legal expert on international humanitarian law. She's a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy of Sandhurst and a fellow of the University of Essex Armed Conflict and Crisis Hub. She's experienced working on international humanitarian law and human rights in academic institutions and nonprofit organizations around the world. Sam Dubberly is the managing director of the Digital Investigations Lab in the Technology and Human Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. He's collaborated with several media organizations as the co-editor of Digital Witness, using open source information for human rights investigation, documentation, and accountability. Tony Wilson is the founder and director of the Security Force Monitor Project. Prior to joining the Human Rights Institute, he worked with the National Security and Human Rights Campaign at the Open Society Foundation. With OSF, he also worked at the Washington Office on Advocacy around the U.S. government policies towards the Middle East and on other multilateral issues. Christina Lamb is the chief foreign correspondent of the Sunday Times and one of Britain's leading foreign correspondents, who has reported for most of the world's hotspots for more than 30 years. And she's the author of 9 books, including Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, War Through the Lives of Women. I will make a brief presentation as well about reporting on genocide and crimes against humanity before we go to audience questions. Now, before we start, just a brief information about the Global Investigative Journalism Network for those who may be not familiar with it. GIJN is the largest global network of nonprofit investigative journalism organizations with 244 member organizations in 90 countries. But it works with journalists everywhere, nonprofits, commercial organizations, and with freelancers. It has extensive range of resources and tip sheets to help for journalists working worldwide, which you can check on their website, which is GIJN.org. I would also like to remind our audience that we have live interpretation from English to Arabic, Russian, and Ukrainian and back. So if you'd like to use these services, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the Zoom screen and select the language you prefer. You can see it down there. We also want to hear from you, and we will be taking questions from the audience. So please send the written questions and messages in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. You can even start asking questions from now on. When the speaker are finished, Global Investigative Journalism Network's Emily O'Sullivan will join us on screen to moderate the questions. And finally, please note that we will be recording this session for posting later on YouTube. So let's start. And as I said, we will be starting with Claire Simmons. Now, Claire, you've written the guides, kind of one of the opening chapter, which looks to explain, what is legal in armed conflict, and can you please tell us a little bit about that process and generally why you think, the journalists need to understand these concepts much better?
Thank you, Dennis. Yep, I'll just put up my slides. Great, thank you. Thanks, Dennis, and thank you to GIJN for hosting the webinar, which unfortunately is as relevant as ever. Just before I start, I need to say that a disclaimer that what I'm presenting today are my views as an academic. It's based on my own research and it does not represent the views of the UK Ministry of Defence or any other entities I'm affiliated to. So as you said, I'm going to go over the very basic principles of law applicable in armed conflict in war to get us started on what we mean when we talk about war crimes from a legal perspective. So hopefully we can be on the same page in this regard. But before I do that, I just wanted to cover a point, namely what is the crossover between law and journalism, what should it be? And you already mentioned, Dennis, a few of these points, and it's covered in the introduction to the guide very well. I recommend people read it. But just to add some of my own brief thoughts on the subject, coming from the legal perspective. Journalists don't need to be lawyers. I mean, there's some few who are both, but they don't need to be. They don't need to be judicial investigators. They don't need to be judges. They have a different function in society. But if they have a proper understanding of the law, this can raise the credibility of the pieces they're reporting on if they're going to be talking about crimes or legal issues. And this credibility can be with various actors. It can help credibility with the readers, with the civilian population, who can gain a better understanding of what war crimes actually are. But it can also raise credibility with the state actors or the military actors themselves if allegations are being made against them and they show that they do actually understand the laws that apply. So having a basic understanding of the legal principles and how to report on them can raise the quality of reporting and help it to be taken more seriously by all sides, in my view. So with this in mind, I'll give a very brief overview of the laws that apply in war. Obviously, I can't go into detail. This is covered more in the guide, including in my chapter on the law. So first of all, what laws apply in armed conflict? I'm going to be talking mostly about a body of law called international humanitarian law. This is sometimes I call it IHL, sorry for the acronyms, but it's also known as the laws of armed conflict or the laws of war. These all mean the same thing, but they're not to be confused with human rights law. Despite the term humanitarian, it's a separate body of law. And you might know some of the treaties from this body of law, including the four Geneva Conventions 1949, which are some of the most famous ones. And international humanitarian law regulates actions of the parties of an armed conflict, so those involved in the fighting, including who they can and cannot target and how they must treat people within their power, for example, when they detain prisoners of war. Another important body of law is international criminal law, which is related, but it's separate, and it allows for the prosecution of individuals for the most serious international crimes, including war crimes. And then we have other bodies of law that also apply that I won't talk about today, but including human rights law, the domestic laws of the states, or other bodies of law that I won't focus on today. So international humanitarian law, if we focus first on this body of law, it's considered to have four fundamental principles. The first two being the need to balance military necessity with humanity. So it's recognized that while states and their militaries are allowed to pursue legitimate military aims in war, including targeting military objectives, it's recognizing that wars happen and that in those wars, military will target military objectives. But they also says that the way they do this is not limited. It must be balanced with the need to maintain humanity in war. There are therefore limits in war in what they can do. The other two principles cover the fact that in the conduct of military operations, parties to a conflict must always respect the principles of distinction and proportionality, which I'm going to explain further. So if we talk about first distinction, this one says that parties to a conflict must at all times distinguish between civilians and combatants on the one hand, and military objectives and civilian objects on the other. So in terms of who can be targeted, mainly it is combatants. This usually means members of the armed forces, but they cannot be targeted if they are hors de combat, meaning if they are sick, wounded, or have surrendered or no longer fighting. Civilians who are taking a direct part in hostilities can also be lawfully targeted. This is sometimes known as DPH. And in terms of what can be targeted, this is military objectives. And this military objectives are considered as such by their nature, for example, a military tank, or because of their location, purpose, or use. So if a civilian train is being used to transport ammunition, it could be considered a military objective by its use. So it's according to this principle of distinction that we understand that civilians can never be targeted, and only combatants and military objectives can be the lawful targets of attack. Does this mean that all civilian deaths or civilian property damage in war is unlawful? Unfortunately not, because we also need to look at the other fundamental principle, which is proportionality. So proportionality in international humanitarian law means that you cannot carry out attacks if there is expected to be civilian harm to people or objects that is excessive in relation to the direct and concrete anticipated military advantage. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but all of those words in that principle are important. It is basically saying that collateral damage, what is sometimes called collateral damage, although that's not a legal term, these are people or objects that are not the targets themselves, but they might be harmed as a side effect of targeting a military objective. This needs to be calculated. You need to figure out what will be the impact of your attack. And this then needs to be balanced with the direct military advantage. If this collateral damage is too high, the attack is unlawful. Proportionality has a specific meaning in this context in international humanitarian law, and it does not mean the same thing as in other contexts, like in proportionality in the use of self-defense, which are sometimes confused the two. I'm laying out the law here. Obviously, how you implement this in practice is a whole other issue. IHL doesn't only deal with targeting, however, and there are other principles and protections. I'll mention a couple here, although because of the timing, we don't have time to go into that much detail. First of all, anyone who's not or no longer taking part in hostilities, including those who've been captured, must be treated humanely in all cases, including they cannot be tortured ever, and protection from inhuman and degrading treatment. Those in custody, including prisoners of war and civilian internees, must also be treated humanely at all times, and there's a bunch of other protections for detainees, including judicial guarantees. There's also a lot of protections around certain emblems or statuses, and IHL provides for special protection, including for the use of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, and Red Crystal emblems that you have here up on the screen. Protecting these emblems is crucial for humanity in armed conflict, because parties to a conflict need to trust that no one, including the enemy, are misusing this emblem in order to gain military advantage. If people start mistrusting these emblems, then you're losing a very fundamental protection in armed conflict. Misusing any of the protections, including these emblems, is a violation of law. And if you use it in a perfidious way, committing perfidy, if you use them in order to kill or injure the enemy, this is considered a war crime because of the serious consequences that it has in armed conflict. There are many other provisions which you can read more about in a brief way in the guide under international humanitarian law. So just to wrap up and to bring it back to war crimes. So where do war crimes fit into this? I've hardly mentioned the term at all in the overview of the law. So war crimes are actually a specific subset of serious violations of international humanitarian law. And you have here, I've tried to depict this by showing you can violate international humanitarian law. And some of the most serious of these violations committed by individuals can be considered war crimes and lead to individual criminal responsibility of individuals. And it is actually states that have a broader responsibility to respect all provisions of the law, not only those that constitute war crimes. And as we saw earlier, not all civilian harm is necessarily a war crime or even a violation of this body of law if it occurs as a result of respecting the other applicable law. So this is what I've tried to depict in these concentric circles here. So in order to figure out whether something being observed is a war crime, the right questions need to be asked. Whether it's a violation or whether it's a war crime or whether it's just civilian harm that might not necessarily constitute either of these things. And one of the problems is that war crimes, especially those relating to targeting, are really difficult to determine upon observation or just by reporting. And this is because we saw earlier that IHL relies on what was known at the time, what the commanders, what those carrying out the attack knew at the time of the attack. It's not about what you know with the benefit of hindsight or what the actual results of the attack. Proportionality, for example, talks about the expected civilian harm, the anticipated military advantage. So you would need to prove these things in order to find individual criminal responsibility if what you want to do is to prove that a crime occurred. And this is often only possible in court. For this reason, it's usually more accurate to report on alleged or possible war crimes until they go to court. And this is also important because all suspects have the right to a fair trial. And this brings us to the other body of law, which is human rights law. Once we're talking about crimes, we're talking about judicial procedures, legal guarantees that kick in these instances. And court cases can be thrown out if procedure is not respected from the beginning. And I just want to end on the point of saying that actually criminal accountability is only one part of justice. Not everything horrible that happens in war is a war crime or even a violation of IHL. And it's one thing that I've tried to explain in this presentation. And often we actually won't know if it is until it's taken to court. Prosecution for war crimes can happen, and I believe some of the next presentations are going to discuss some of these cases and how it can happen. For example, in the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Court also brings some of these cases. Domestic courts have taken war criminals to court as well. And journalists can have an important role in getting these things to happen. But there's plenty of other things that matter for accountability, including truth-telling, making the voices heard, telling the stories of those affected by war. So criminal prosecution is an important part of justice, but on its own, it's not sufficient for accountability. Law has its own purposes that it serves, and journalism can potentially serve towards that, but also many others. And in a democratic society, we can also politically demand that states do more than the legal minimum. And with that, I'm going to stop there and I'll hand over back to you, Dennis.
Thank you very much, Claire, for a really, really important explanation on some of these really complex topics. It's really easy for me to take over from this because you really ended on the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which is where most of the work for prosecuting war crimes committed in the Bosnian conflict, which lasted from 1992 to 1995, happened, which is something that the organization that I work for and that works in Bosnia and Herzegovina is really specialized for. So we monitored all of these processes. And what's important to note is that really for when we talk about accountability, the importance of individual testimony is key. Basically in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because of the work of this UN-run court, the ICTY, and consequently the work of domestic courts, we now have a body of about 1,100 completed cases, which is a huge number of prosecuted war crimes. It's very rare that you will find other conflicts that have had this level of judicial prosecutions for. However, what our analysis show is that individual testimony, survivor testimony, and also obviously people who were involved in the actual hostilities, so insider witnesses and so forth, are the backbone of criminal prosecutions. It is much more rare to find the actual documentation, which would be a smoking gun. And in most of these cases, they rely on the individual testimonies, which really helps, I think, the role of journalism in that sense, because it raises, I think, helps explain what our role is, because we are the ones that are often bringing for the first time those testimonies as conflicts happen live, and then also in the aftermath of other conflicts. It's important to understand how gathering testimonies and publishing them in sometimes digital archives or investigative pieces or features can bring forward accountability. I will be talking a little bit today about the two chapters that I've written for the guide, and they are related to investigating genocide and crimes against humanity. Now, I've given a little bit of explanation related to the work that the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network in Bosnia and Herzegovina has done. Just a brief kind of overview of the Balkan Wars. So in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the conflict lasted from 92 to 95. There were about 100,000 people killed in this conflict. And what's important to note is that because of this large number of criminal prosecutions that we've had, the only court-determined genocide in Europe after World War II occurred on the ground of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Srebrenica in 1995, where about 7,000 men and boys were killed. And in terms of crimes against humanity, we have a significant number of criminal prosecutions and convictions for really systematic crimes and crimes against humanity that have occurred. Now, in reporting about these really complex criminal acts that have happened in the war, I think it's important to go back to what Claire said, to take the time to understand the basics of international humanitarian law. This is important for several reasons. One of them is that there's this false understanding that war crimes against civilians and combatants are the most, the least horrible of crimes, and then you go up and it's crimes against humanity, and then you go up and the worst possible crime is genocide. It is not like that in international humanitarian law. They are different crimes. And in that sense, they require different elements to prove. And in many cases around the world, and in many instances that we've, some of the most brutal crimes that have happened have actually been crimes against humanity, and have been in some ways much more brutal than crimes of genocide that we've seen. So what's important to understand is to understand what constitutes genocide and what crimes against humanity. When we talk about genocide, it requires an intent to destroy in part or in whole a particular protected group. So in that sense, it is the key kind of element, while when we talk about crimes against humanity, they can occur even in peacetime and require proving that the actions of a particular unit or organization were part of a widespread and systematic attack against the protected group. And just to explain how difficult sometimes it can be to kind of set these two apart, is that extermination is a particular crime against humanity. And in many cases, that will look much like what people expect genocide to be. But we need to think about what the actual legal term is and how that will influence our reporting. In this sense, I think that's why trials, when they take place, can be an invaluable source of information, because they bring together a multitude of testimonies, evidence produced that journalists would usually not have access to, also reports from international organizations that are monitoring activities or that are on the ground, and that often have much more of level of access than journalists do, like the International Red Cross and others. And in that sense, gathering all of these testimonies can be vital in explaining and understanding some of the patterns that may happen, and also because trials allow us to understand who are the individuals that have been prosecuted, but also provide us an avenue to understand or to find out or investigate who are the individuals that have evaded prosecution. So in that sense, if you find on a particular area that you have a multitude of
Sorry, could you just bring the mic a little closer? Sorry. Thank you. For the interpreters, sorry.
Sure, I'll try. It's important to understand that through these war crimes, it is possible to find out who are the individuals that have evaded prosecutions, and in that sense, we can find out if in a particular area you have a multitude of individual war crimes that have been committed and prosecuted, if we don't have a convictions or prosecution against a commander for failing to stop or to punish these atrocities. These are the kind of things that trials allow us to prove much more easily than it would happen in generally in journalism when you're just doing journalist work. Our media outlet published over a dozen investigative articles in the past 5 years using this kind of technique, and we've used evidence that was presented in court and testimonies that we've gathered to prove who are the individual perpetrators that have evaded justice. And there are now 3 cases that have been started and indictments raised against individuals that we've consequently written about. Now, how do you do this? Basically, is to first of all find out where these criminal prosecutions are taking place, and they can take place in international tribunals for several in several avenues. They can happen in domestic prosecutions, and they also sometimes happen in countries around the world which apply the concept of universal jurisdiction. So it's possible that, and it happens that you have cases for war crimes in Syria happening, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in France, and it's important to monitor all of these cases to gather as much of these verdicts as you can, to read thoroughly, find the evidence and testimonies, and most importantly, what are the determined facts related to events, individuals, dates, commanders of units, and then to get a broader picture and to find overlapping patterns. Then you can use traditional journalist technique of interviewing survivors, building your digital narrative, which combines the testimonies with the evidence or the court-determined facts to really publish really impactful investigative pieces. Now, understanding these complexities and the legal terms that I've tried to explain in brief and that Claire talked about much more coherently is also vital about when you're reporting even about crimes that are happening in real time. And I think many of the same principles do apply. The key journalists the key thing is to talking to survivors, those who are close to a crime scene, those who are first to arrive, those who have a much larger amount of access. But when we're talking about investigating crimes against humanity or genocide, it's important to try to ensure that you get as much testimony as you can, because you're looking to find patterns and overlap in a much more systematic effort than when we're talking about individual atrocities. You can also try and use organizations that are trying in real time to support people who are leaving a certain area or survivors in order to get multiple witness testimonies and to see how much of it overlaps, what you can verify immediately, and which kind of patterns you can see emerging. You have to be very cautious with the language that you are using when you are reporting, because in many instances the journalistic work that you will be publishing in the first days, perhaps, of in the aftermath of a certain crime, will be used in some ways even to discredit witnesses when they are before a court. So in some cases, they will be used by defense lawyers when witnesses come to testify, to ask them, why did you tell the journalists A or B or C? So you have to be very careful about how you phrase exactly what the witness says, how many details you want to put in, and how that is vital for your story. When we talk about emerging patterns, it's also important to develop a filing system, name coding, color coding, date coding, because when you have this amount of witness testimonies, of reports, of various information that you're gathering from verdicts or through FOIA requests, you will be forced to have a huge amount of information. If you don't develop very early on a filing and reporting system, it will be much more difficult to find emerging patterns. And then just to end with, when we talk about these patterns that can happen, that you need to look for, they can be related to which is the agency involved. So who is actually committing these atrocities? You might find that there is a methodology that's being implemented by a particular side where it systematically uses volunteer fighters or indiscriminate shelling or any of these things, which can be classified as crimes against humanity, or even to a degree genocide if the consequences are the destruction or the intent to destroy a group. They can be who is the group that's being targeted through these crimes, the circumstances in which these crimes take place, or even in the method of killing. And it's important to understand these concepts much more in order to see these patterns much more clearly. And if you do, that will help you build much more in-depth analytical pieces and investigations. I will stop sharing my screen now. I will also stop there because I'm trying to leave as much time as possible for questions and answers, because I think for all of the topics that we are covering, it is very, very difficult to explain everything you need to in a short presentation. And we've talked a lot about witness testimony, but for my next speaker, I will call Sam Dubberly to tell us a little bit more about his contribution to the guide, which focuses on open source investigations. Now, that obviously includes as well talking to survivors of witness and verification, but it also entails a lot of other things that are extremely helpful in especially monitoring current wars and conflicts that are happening. So Sam, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dennis, and really great to be joining you all today. Thanks very much for inviting Human Rights Watch along for the ride, and also been a great pleasure to contribute to this really fantastic this project with GIJN. And also, just say on a personal level, I have great recollections of working with the Bosnian Balkans Investigative Reporters Network when I used to be at Amnesty on some rather heinous crimes that happened in Iraq. So it was a great collaboration with you all then. It's great to see you here today. But now I have a Human Rights Watch hat on. I'm the director of digital investigations, or the Digital Investigations Lab at Human Rights Watch, which is a small team based within the research, what we call the program office or the research department at Human Rights Watch, where we support with a small team, and I'll come to that in a second. We support HRW's various different research using what's, I guess, commonly these days called open source investigations, digital investigations, visual investigations. There's been many brand names given to it, but using information, digital information that's freely available to researchers, to journalists, to reporters, to human rights investigators, to war crimes investigators. And we try to bring that into HRW's research without making too many, well, without making any errors really, but also using this information to back up. And I think that's the important point I'd like to drive home here. Both Claire and Dennis, spoke about the importance of talking to people, of speaking to witnesses, of getting information from witnesses who've experienced, who've seen, who've lived through, awful things that have happened to them, which could indeed be war crimes. And our role at Human Rights Watch is to make some determination as to whether or not these are indeed war crimes or not. As a human rights organization, we are not journalists. Our role is very much limited to, or our mandate is very much limited to what happens in the war, and to work out if the warring parties are actually following the laws of war or not, which is hard, as Claire alluded to. There's lots of different considerations we have to make, and that's why we still have this firm, tried and trusted methodology of speaking to people, of deploying to the sites of possible war crimes whenever possible, which is not always the case, but also alongside with my team then of 5 researchers who are geospatial experts or video verification experts or quantitative data experts. We also have arms experts in Human Rights Watch. We're then trawling through social media, Telegram, TikTok, so on and so forth, and looking at freely available or purchasable satellite imagery to determine if what we're seeing in the digital space actually matches also what we're seeing or hearing from witnesses in the physical space, on the physical front line. So we have worked as a team on pretty much every conflict, be that Myanmar, be that Syria, be that Ukraine, be that Sudan, be that the ongoing conflict in Gaza. We're working on all of those as our team and backing up our research teams who are interviewing people. So how do we, with that in mind, we're not going to be making determinations on if something is a war crime or not based solely on digital investigations. But what we are doing is using it, as I said, to back up some of the things we're hearing and some of the things we're seeing. And I just wanted to go through, and also from the guide, give some examples of how we're doing that and where we think it's particularly important without overplaying the role. And, open source information has become the shiny new thing of investigations. I think it's a very important part of investigations, but it's certainly not the be-all and end-all of investigations. And we are at Human Rights Watch, as all journalists are able to as well, produce very compelling evidence without digital investigations. So, but when we do have it, it is a very powerful part of the jigsaw. This is something we actually published yesterday on the ongoing conflict in West Darfur, where we spotted using geospatial information, we were able to determine that a village had been destroyed earlier this month. We're not quite in December yet. Earlier this month in West Darfur in Sudan, and what we're always looking for there is, is there actually any military presence? And actually, very helpfully for us, and helpfully for researchers, often warring parties will share information, so what we call perpetrator information, online, which we're then able to verify and confirm. So we're often using open source information, looking for who we can identify, if we can identify any military units through videos and photographs, if we can identify any military activity through videos and photographs, and does that back up what we're hearing? And then this leads us to actually, investigating the uniforms that you're seeing here, making sure they're consistent with the uniforms that, in this case, the RSF in Sudan, we'd expect them to be wearing. If possible, can we study accents or what people are saying, kind of understanding if that is actually consistent of the geography that we understand this video to be filmed, and so on and so forth, or to make out that verification and determination if we can use this in our evidence and in our reporting. So military units and activity are a very important part of this. We're also, and as Claire mentioned very clearly in her presentation, always considering what is a possible military target and what is not a military target. This is an instance from the town of Kremenchuk in Ukraine last year, in June of last year, where we investigated a missile attack on which hit a shopping center in Kremenchuk, which was open. There was a lot of disinformation about this attack at the time. First of all, the Russian Ministry of Defense said the shopping mall was closed, that they were targeting a factory in which there was military equipment being stored, and so on and so forth. So not only were we able to actually get to the side of this attack and interview a lot of people, we were also able to, using open source information, then determine where the 2 missiles that hit the shopping mall actually hit, that there was indeed a factory nearby, but in terms of proportionality determinations, there was an open shopping center. We could see online and investigate online to see people actually posting receipts from the shopping center, working out that actually none of the missiles hit. Well, one did actually. The southernmost one actually just hit inside the factory, very close to a park, destroying other buildings. So then our determination was using using the satellite imagery, making that assessment on the factories, making that assessment on the shopping mall, and using open source information to prove that the shopping mall was actually open and operational at the time of the attack, killing civilians, that it should be investigated as a possible war crime. So we're always using open source information to check for possible military targets. We're also using it to look for civilian activity. So if there is no military target that we can see, or was there a possible military target that we can't see, or people haven't told us about, we're using open source information also to look for civilian activity. This was a cluster munitions strike on the town of Kramatorsk, which killed 58 people in Ukraine last year, in April of last year. And here we were able to gather a whole host of open source information, which was showing just how many civilians were actually on the train platform at the time, waiting for trains to flee to the west of Ukraine. And we were able to actually use that open source information to individually count the number of people that were there. We were only able to get to the site several days later. So actually interviewing people at that point isn't actually very good for understanding the civilian activity that's around there. So the videos and the photographs and the assessment we were able to make using videos and photographs were actually really important. So being able to get that from the time, verify it to the location, geolocate to the location, and then do a close granular analysis of who was there. Is there anybody with obvious military uniforms? If not, who is there? Why are they there? What kind of activities are they undertaking? Then we're also using it a lot for weapons identification. This can be very hard. This can also be fairly straightforward in some cases. This is an instance of a recent cluster munitions attack, sadly, in Idlib in Syria, where that's still ongoing. We were able to identify this carrier body of an Uragan missile, which distributed cluster munitions over a village just outside Idlib, killing 2 people in the attack and leading to children picking up the cluster munitions later and wounding themselves. So being able to identify that this was an Uragan, a Russian-made Uragan cluster munition distribution body that had landed just by a school is also a very important part of the investigation process. If you can then get closer up, if people often take pictures of bullet casings, of serial numbers, you can then start to track that even further backwards, and that's actually what we were able to do with the Balkans Investigative Reporters Network back when we were working in Iraq a few years ago. So that can be a very important part and a very useful part of open source investigations. And then when we're not able to access a site and talk to people and see wounds themselves, we're also often using open source information, sadly, and this is where I think we need to also understand the toll that this can take on our mental health, but to assess injuries using forensic pathologies. So at Human Rights Watch, we've taken time to build up a network of people who are able to investigate images and photographs to give us a determination of how injuries occurred, because an injury caused by a gunshot wound or an injury caused by explosive weapons is very different. So building networks of experts in these areas becomes very important. And then I'll end with the last part, which is just conscious of time, is what's also is very important in thinking about targeting, because obviously open source information is not going to give us any insight into the person, the individuals, the units who are giving the orders to target a location, especially if we're thinking about airstrikes or artillery fire. But it can give us an idea of the prior state of the attack site. And what I mean by that is there information we can find out on open source, which then we could argue the military who decided to target an institution. And as we see here is the famous Mariupol theater with the words children written in front. We could see that from space. We could see that on satellite imagery. So then there was a question of, the targeting decision maker, the officer deciding to target a location should know this beforehand, if we can see this beforehand clearly on satellite. So it allows you to get an idea of what was going on before the actual attack itself. So I'll stop there. This is an overview of some of the things I mentioned in the article, and open for any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, so much. That was really, really interesting, and I think showed the multitude of ways in which open source information can and should be used. Basically, we've talked a little bit now about the laws of war, about how to investigate patterns, about how to gather evidence through testimonies and through using open source. And all of that together allows us in some ways to investigate the people who are the most responsible for those atrocities. Now, Tony Wilson has written one of the chapters on the guide that really looks more deeply into that and how to investigate the command structures. So Tony, over to you. Can you please give us an overview how all of this together helps us build the investigations, and how should we use them to find who are the people who are most responsible for the atrocities committed?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Tony Wilson, founder and director of the Security Force Monitor, which is a project of the Human Rights Institute at Columbia Law School. What I'm going to talk about briefly is how we build that chain of command, focusing on different case studies that are in the chapter. So you can read more about it there. And I'll try to kind of connect certain points back to the previous presenters' conversations as well. So just briefly, our mission is to use open source research to build the chains of commands, document the areas of operation and commanders of police and military forces, and other state forces around the world, using that information to support human rights groups and journalists documenting violations and looking to hold the forces accountable for any violations they may have committed. So what that means, though, is really delving into a very different universe of sources. And again, I'm going to focus on the kind of open source part of this. Obviously, as journalists, you all can go and ask questions, get documents and other things that are outside of the open source world and that are appropriate for your roles as journalists. So one of the first things that we do when looking at a particular security force is actually look at what the forces themselves say about their structure and about themselves. So when we're working with Sheila Cornell and the Stiville Center, looking at the drug war in the Philippines and killings around there, one of the first things we did was look at the Philippine National Police and see what they say about their own structure, what information they put out. It may or may not be accurate. At the time, the PNP actually said that they were founded on June 31st, 1990, which is not a date. So there's always errors or omissions or other things in these sources, but they're still really valuable and useful place to start your investigations. So here is a screenshot from a command chart that's actually on the PNP's own site. It lays out in general terms the police structure for Metro Manila. It gives us some indication of that structure, but doesn't provide the details. But it opens it up to continue the investigation and use something that I referred to in the chapter of unusual sources. So in this investigation, our next stop was actually looking at the phone book and seeing what that tells us about the structure, given that we have this command chart and we have a general sense of how things are together. So looking at the phone book, we can see, all right, this is a police station and these things listed underneath it, the police community precincts. are those substations that report up to that police station, and also have a list of kind of administrative areas that each substation is responsible for, and thus the overall police station is responsible for. And this is kind of the next really big concept to understand when investigating security forces, which is, what are the administrative divisions of the country? What are the provinces, districts, townships, municipios, barangays, what have you, of the country? Because those are fundamentally important to how the security forces organize themselves, how they establish control and command over these areas, and thus can be linked through the chain of command or otherwise establish responsibility for any violations that take place in these areas. So just to give a sense of that, from Burkina Faso, the gendarme and police themselves put out maps showing the territories that they're responsible for and how it's divided up against the particular units. Again, because this concept is so sort of important, especially for the police, of how they organize themselves, but also for the military. In this case, in Mexico, this is a map that the army itself put out. It's very simplified, but kind of showing its different regional commands. And this is really important for our work supporting Caldo de Mando and Comisión Mexicana de Promoción y Defensa Derechos Humanos, looking at the role of the Mexican army in operations in Ciudad Juarez on the border with the United States, where a special joint force was set up, where about a third of the army rotated through Ciudad Juarez over a 2-year period. And there is many dozens and dozens and dozens of allegations of violations committed by these units. And so they were rotating up into this yellow area on the top of the map, that 5A area. Once they got there, they were under control of that 5th military zone under this joint task force, but they also had parallel lines of command in other parts of the country. So you could actually have units accused of committing, the same unit accused of committing violations in 2 different parts of the country simultaneously under 2 different chains of command, because they're in 2 different locations, in 2 different administrative areas, which is how the army kind of structures itself. So this sort of approach of building the chain of command, looking at the geography, looking at what the forces themselves say about them, is a great way to kind of build up that picture of who's responsible for what. But sometimes that's not enough, or there's other kind of questions that are difficult to kind of answer just based on this research, but it might open up, as to Claire's presentation, other avenues for thinking about how this reporting can be used in terms of accountability and building a narrative and truth-telling around what's going on. So with our investigation with the Washington Post, looking at the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, the issue for us wasn't really the chain of command, although there was issues around that. It was the inability, based on the evidence we had, to determine a specific airstrike was conducted by a specific squadron of the various air forces. But what we could do was, using open source information, looking at what the forces themselves said about their structures, looking at reporting about contracts and sales of different planes and platforms to the various coalition countries, is build up a picture to determine the most comprehensive picture of which individual squadrons actually served in Yemen, which ones were potentially benefited or did benefit from US contracting during the kind of height of the airstrike campaigns there, and which of these units were trained by the United States during the course of the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. And while this isn't directly pinning a specific unit to a specific thing, a specific airstrike, it is another path to sort of thinking about connections and culpability and other concerns around support for forces that are accused of committing violations, in this case in Yemen. And so I want to end kind of bringing these pieces together that I've talked about, looking at Myanmar. And this is a screenshot from a report that we released earlier this month, looking at the Army over a 12-year period. And often when you're investigating these forces, you won't find that singular source, be it interviewing somebody, a leaked document, or open source research that we do, that will lay out the entire chain of command, all of the commanders and everything on the particular day that incident occurred. That's just incredibly difficult. But what you can do is pulling together various bits of what each source says about the chain of command, about individual units, about individual commanders, and pull that together to actually build the puzzle and put all the pieces together to see what the chain of command was at any particular moment in time. So this visual is kind of trying to represent that. So we have this allegation, this dotted line of a particular point in time. We don't have a source that says, okay, this unit was under this and commanded by this person and so on and so forth. But what we do have is shown by those individual squares, those individual triangles and circles, is various sources at different points in time that establish this continuity of this battalion's under this military operations command. This regional command is responsible for the area. This person was in charge of that regional command, and so on. That allows us to build the chain of command from a low-level unit all the way to the top of the chain of command. And this can allow us then to see for any sort of specific allegation to build that chain of command to understand who was where when. So this allegation against the 77th Light Infantry Division can be connected, and as you can see, it has two parallel chains of command on up to this specific individual and on up to the top of the chain. And while this is really important, and while I think a lot of the focus has been on building the chain of command or investigating kind of singular incidents, I want to also kind of end with a different way to think about the chain of command, a different way to think about building evidence or building the story of potential war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that's to think about the chain of command in the aggregate. So what we did here is look at the chain of command over that 12-year period and see every single individual that held the different positions during that time. And so the story here is not how many individual allegations happened under a specific person. It's really, if you look at the 1st Bureau of Special Operations there as an example, every single person who ever served during that 12-year period has allegations under their command. Their subordinate, the Northern Regional Military Command, which is responsible for Kachin State, almost every single person who ever served there had allegations under their during their command. And this sort of view is really important for building kind of elements of that you can read more in Claire's chapter of, were these violations part of a widespread and systematic attack? Did the commander know, should have known that these violations were taking place? Did they do anything to remedy it afterwards? Were these commanders promoted or rewarded after serving? This kind of shows a different view that these individual allegations, these sort of individual violations, alleged violations that people allegedly suffered can be connected to a bigger picture and a broader story about how the army or police or what have you is operating in the country. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tony, for that really excellent presentation and for that different kind of way of looking at accountability. Now, one particular subset of war crimes and crimes against humanity that often goes unpunished and unprosecuted are crimes that are related to wartime sexual violence. And we are very lucky today to have Christina Lamb, who has reported from a multitude of conflicts around the world, and who's written one of the best chapters in the guide that looks into this particular topic. So Christina, please, the floor is yours.
Sorry. Thank you very much. So I'm delighted to be part of this panel and hear the fascinating presentations from everybody else. As Dennis said, I'm going to talk specifically about really the world's most neglected war crime, which is an issue I feel very strongly about, which the international community is really failing to address, which is the specific war crime of sexual violence, which I believe we're seeing a veritable epidemic of around the world. Rather appropriately, I'm actually currently speaking to you from Israel in the aftermath of October the 7th, which is a place where not only do you have to deal with the sensitivity of covering the issue, generally protecting survivors and yourself, but in a conflict where propaganda is used probably more than in any other. So I can talk specifically about that later, but I thought I'd just talk a little bit about how and why I got involved in this in the first place. So I've been a foreign correspondent for 35 years, mostly covering conflict, and I'm used to meeting people, sadly, with horrific stories. And as a woman, I've got used to the fact that what happens to women in war is all too often ignored. I've written a lot about the heroism of women in war. I'm not really that interested in the fighting, the bang-bang, which is mostly between men. I'm much more interested in how people keep their lives together during war, which is much more often the women. But there is, as you know, a dark side of what happens to women in war, and that's the use of sexual violence against women and girls. And I have to say that in recent years, I have come across this more and more stories of such brutality that I find hard to listen to and hard to write. As you know, women everywhere around the world, 1 in 3 women is likely to experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, but that risk is much heightened during war. And it seems to me that we really are seeing an epidemic of it currently. It's happening as we speak in the Democratic Republic of Congo on a big scale, Afghanistan, Sudan, the detention centers in Iran, Belarus, and of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, of course, Ukraine, and now apparently here in Israel. So I first heard about this on a big scale in 2015 when I was covering the refugee crisis, and I was on a Greek island of Leros, and I met a group of Yazidi women who had fled, and I could see that something absolutely terrible had happened to them from the way they looked. They looked like all the light had gone out from their eyes, but I didn't actually know what had happened. And they started telling me eventually this horrific story, which seemed to me the worst thing I'd ever heard at the time, of being taken by Islamic State fighters from their villages and taken to a place called Galaxy Cinema, a kind of slave market where they had been then put on display for ISIS fighters to come and touch their hair, touch their breasts, and decide which they wanted to take. I thought this was horrifying, but at the same time, I was going to Nigeria quite a lot. You might remember the Chibok girls taken from their school in the middle of the night in Nigeria, northeastern Nigeria, which was like the biggest story on earth for about 2 weeks. And then everybody forgot about it, even though actually almost 10 years on, half those girls are still missing. And so I started traveling around northeastern Nigeria and found that actually the Chibok girls were just the tip of the iceberg, that actually tens of thousands of girls and women had been taken by Boko Haram fighters and made into their so-called bushwives. But when I met some of the rescued women and girls as young as 12 in camps, They told me that when they'd been rescued by Nigerian military, they'd often been raped again, and that when they were taken to the camps, they were ostracized by their families who wouldn't take them back because they saw them as sullied. And so the only way that they could actually survive was to sleep with camp officials. And to me, this is one of the most terrible things about this crime, that the very people who are the victims are often made to feel shame that they did something wrong. Then a couple of years after that was in Bangladesh in 2017, when the Rohingya people were fleeing across the border en masse, around 700,000 people in 3 months from Myanmar, because Buddhist militias and Burmese soldiers were coming into their villages, setting fire to their huts, dragging out the women, tying them to banana trees, and gang raping them in front of their children. What was interesting was in each of those cases, the women were actually coming forward and telling their story, even though these stories are very hard to tell. And yet, not a single person was being prosecuted. In fact, it was not really being even that much reported by media. The Yazidis perhaps more, but when I tried to report these things, my male foreign editor literally said to me, nobody wants to read these stories. One day, one of those Yazidis sent me a WhatsApp, and she said to me in that WhatsApp, we told our story, but nothing changed. And I thought about that, and I just felt really, really bad and couldn't answer why that was the case. It made me feel sad. It made me feel angry. So I started to research much more on this subject, why it was happening more, collecting stories of some of the survivors, not really with the plan of doing a book at the beginning, but in the end I did write this book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, because it seemed important to collect these testimonies together and show how great the scale was. In fact, I really feel like I could have spent the rest of my life writing that book, but I've covered 12 countries on 4 continents. That book came out 2 or 3 years ago, and yet since then we've had Ukraine, and then here in Israel where it's happened again. And of course, people will say there's always been rape in war. If you go back to the Homer's Iliad, for example, begins with Achilles and Agamemnon arguing over who would get an abducted woman. But we are in 2023, and what I was really looking at was rape being used as a weapon of war, where fighters have literally been ordered to rape. And sadly, it is a highly effective weapon if you want to clear a village of people or humiliate your enemy. And it, as one militia said, is far cheaper than a Kalashnikov bullet. I think a lot about why it should be happening more. I think it's partly because, and I'm really convinced it is more, it's not just that we're hearing about it more. I think it's partly because war has changed shape. Most recent conflicts are no longer state on state, but often non-state actors. They're often fought among civilian populations. So we're actually seeing a much higher proportion of civilian casualties. But I think it's also because of impunity. Almost every woman I spoke to said she wanted justice, although I think justice means different things to different people. It doesn't necessarily mean seeing perpetrators in the dock. But there's no doubt that accountability remains the exception, not the rule. So how do we report this? Well, I mean, journalists are often the very first people to interview deeply traumatized people, and yet we have no specific training for this. As I talked about being on the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh, we were all standing there with our notebooks and cameras as people crossed over asking what happened to you. And I don't think we appreciate what damage we could do, not just in terms of re-traumatizing people by making them tell their story again and again. And by the way, it's not just us. Often aid agencies will, because they want to highlight particular cases for their own benefit will keep taking journalists to speak to the same person. So I think it's often important to think about why somebody is taking you to speak to one of these people. But also we can damage if they do try and get legal help, we can actually damage their legal cases, because if somebody has been interviewed by lots of different journalists and each one has reported the details slightly different, that makes it very easy for a defense lawyer to just shoot down the testimony. So when I was doing this book, I mean, I didn't just go to camps or places and say, has anyone here been raped, and speak English in that awful, perhaps apocryphal phrase, but I went to particular organizations, which I think is the best way to do it. I went to legal organizations, I went to medical organizations or trauma counselors or centers for survivors, and spoke to the people running those, explained what I was doing, and asked them, will you speak to your clients or the people you're helping, and ask if any of them would like to tell their story. And actually quite a lot of people do want to tell their story because they don't want it to happen to other people. But it's very important how we do this. So as writing this book made me very aware of this, and at the end of it, I worked with an American film director, Leslie Thomas, who made a very good film called The Prosecutors, about people who prosecute sexual violence in conflict. She had the same kind of unease as me about this. So we worked with some survivors to try and actually come up with guidelines of what they felt was the best way to be interviewed. And those you can find on the website of something called the DART Center. But basically, the main thing that they said was that they wanted people to talk to them where they wanted. They wanted to be in a place they were happy at the amount of time they wanted. Now, one of the problems is journalists are in a hurry. They just want, to get to the most dramatic thing. And in fact, these stories take a long time to tell. I spent days talking to some of the people. I think you have to be very clear at the beginning to say to people, anytime you feel uncomfortable, just stop. And if you decide that you don't want to do this, that's fine. It's your decision. So in my case for the book, only one person decided that it was too difficult. Most people did talk, but we did it really slowly. We talked about other things, and that was one of the other things that almost everybody I spoke to said, we don't want to just be our trauma, we want to be regarded as people with hopes and dreams, and not just that. So talk to us about what it is we want to do in life. What were we doing before this happened? And I think if I have any one message is, don't leave people hanging at the end. Don't get to the really awful thing that happened and then close your notebook or turn off the camera and say, great, that's wonderful, thank you, goodbye. Actually spend time then talking to the person about what they can do, a constructive conversation, and maybe chat about other things. The Yazidis that I talk to a lot, likes then to have eat together, and we just chat about food. And they said to me once, none of the journalists that come talk to us about these things, they just want to hear our stories and then go. And so I do think that's really important. And lastly, it's important to protect yourself. These are really difficult stories to hear. For my part, like the survivors themselves, I find nature very healing. I live near a river and park, so I go look at trees and remember that there's still beauty in the world, even if it sometimes seems far away. But I think I'll leave that there because I can see we don't have much time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. That was a really, really good presentation. Now we have a little bit more time, which I'm really grateful for all our speakers for keeping things pretty short. So please, I will leave this now to Emily O'Sullivan, who's going to moderate the questions, and we have about 20 minutes, so she can help us decide which are the questions that we will be taking during the course.
Thanks, Dennis, and thank you to that our panel. That was really interesting. We have a lot of good questions, too many questions, but the first one is for Claire. You discussed proportionality, and the question is how is proportionality calculated, and at what point is damage to the civilian population considered a crime? And then following on from that, how can journalists submit evidence of potential international war crimes?
Thank you. It's a very difficult one. How is proportionality calculated? There isn't an algorithm, and we're asking to do something that's very, well, almost inhuman in balancing a military advantage versus the cost of human life or human damage. Militaries have their own way of calculating proportionality of what they think makes sense. This is usually confidential information. Most of the cases that have made it to court, if at all, are sort of the black and white cases where you can see it's grossly disproportionate. And actually, this is how it's talked about in the International Criminal Court. The war crime is written, it's codified, it's written down as something that is grossly disproportionate, because the sort of grey areas are going to be very difficult to prove. So in terms of taking something to court, proportionality, it's most likely only possible when you're talking about something that's so obviously disproportionate. One of the other difficulties, and actually this goes back to a lot of what Sam and also Tony mentioned in terms of when you're getting down to trying to figure out what happened, who knew what, the chains of command, how can you figure out what happened in the attack, is that proportionality also requires knowing what the attacker knew at the time. You have to prove this sort of criminal intent, that they knew it was going to be disproportionate when they were planning the attack and they carried it out anyway, or that they didn't take feasible precautions in checking certain things. I don't know if that's somewhat, I know that's not an answer to the question, but there is no answer to the question. I would recommend looking up some of the cases where proportionality has been tried to be taken to court. And the International Committee of the Red Cross has very good resources on sort of what the law says. I think the other part of the question was about evidence getting to court. There's some information in the guide on this, but my main point would be, what court are you talking about? You need to decide that, and if you're even thinking of doing that, is to think, what court is it? Is the International Criminal Court? Is it a domestic court? And then find lawyers who are expert in those courts in that jurisdiction and ask them, what would I need in order, if I'm even thinking going down that route, because there are specific rules of evidence. The evidence needs to be kept a certain way, and this changes depending on where you're talking about. So if you're going to court, that's almost a separate route than if what you're doing is raising awareness about an issue to point out that it might be a war crime, that someone should investigate it in a judicial way, versus if you actually want to get involved yourself in the judicial aspect.
Thank you. The next question is for Dennis, and it's, what are the ethical and professional challenges journalists go through when publishing war crimes investigations and interviewing victims? So you discussed being careful with language and filing documents properly. And to follow up on that as well, when journalists are using a filing system to track crimes against humanity, do you have any advice on how to protect important documents from being compromised?
That's, both of those are really good questions, and especially the first one is extremely difficult and very difficult to answer in such a short period of time. I do recommend reading the entire guide, because it's not very good, and all of them contain aspects that are important in terms of ethical considerations and in terms of what we perceive to be some of the most difficult things. But my main one that I want to touch upon is, and this is extremely important because it does happen a lot, is that journalists often come to the field or to areas that are still in conflict or just outside of conflict, just entering peacetime, and they have a short period of time. They work with fixers, and they want really fast interviews. And we've heard this a minute ago, and this kind of, when you come in and says who's been raped and who speaks English, and unfortunately this does still happen. And I think understanding the trauma levels to which people have gone through, understand that these are their lives that have been destroyed, really, I think, helps us keep in mind how we should approach our investigations. Also, the ideas of keeping their identity safe. A lot of times we've seen through our reporting at GIJN is that people are sometimes willing to go on the record, to go with their full first and last name and to speak about certain things, but later on they change their mind. So I think it's important to take the time to talk them through that these things will be online forever, and to really understand when it is vital for you to use all of that information in your article. If you're just writing a feature story, maybe the full first and last name is not that important. So all of these things are very important, and there's a million others. In terms of keeping your information safe and a filing system, there are, and you can Google this, there are various programs now that you can use to track your to track the kind of information and the documents that you have. You can also create your own filing system. I don't think this is vital. I think it's just very, very important that you think about this strategically, because when you are doing investigations about genocide or crimes against humanity, that this requires such an amount of documentation and evidence and testimony that you will be at a certain point in time, if you don't have a strategic approach to it, really overwhelmed. So that would be my advice.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions for Sam. You've mentioned social media and other open source material, as well as the importance of interviews and witness testimony. What other sources can you suggest for an investigative journalist, and what are your most commonly used open source tools?
I mean, some great questions. I mean, I think on the open source side of things, I think a familiarity with tools such as Google Earth Pro can add huge value to reporting, especially if we're looking at investigating, a potential strike on a location. So trying to work out what it was, if there's any military objectives there, mixing that with information that's provided on OpenStreetMap, which is a freely available mapping tool, and kind of crossing those two over with Google Earth Pro and OpenStreetMap are all freely available tools. And then I think an understanding, and there's plenty of tutorials out there on YouTube by some excellent people on how to source information through the different social media platforms. I think one of the biggest questions or challenges is, where do you find, if you're looking for videos and photographs of evidence of crimes, it's where do you find the videos and photographs? And a quick example of that, this isn't necessarily specifically a war crime, but a very awful incident that we reported on killings at the Saudi border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And we were looking for video evidence, thinking it would be on Instagram or thinking that it would be on Facebook, because that's where it always used to be, until we realized it was on TikTok. And, understanding the social media landscape, who is using what platforms where, and how then to search those platforms, I think is a well worthwhile investment for anybody trying to get into open source information investigations.
Thank you. Tony, this may be a bit difficult to answer in the limited time that we have. But one question we have for you is, can you give an example of a successful chain of command journalism investigation in a situation of war that can help journalists to understand your methodology? Sorry.
No. Yeah, well, actually, I'll say this wasn't war, but it was a really good investigation that linked to in the guide. What comes to mind is the investigation of killing of protesters by the Nigerian army in Abuja, which this was supporting New York Times investigation. And so that was a good kind of mix of both what, kind of the open source world and the journalism angle on the chain of command in particular, because there was information about the particular battalion that was evidenced in the video shooting the protesters, but the chain of command information itself that was open source was from a single article from 2010, and these killings happened much later than that. And so it was really the journalist's role to say, okay, well, we have this one source. We can't just say we have this one article in 2010, this is thus forever true and always will be true. But we have a basis to say, okay, well, this was reported in 2010. Is this still correct? Is this still the case? And that allowed them to find the sources to confirm that was true and find kind of additional information to build and kind of build that story of that complete chain of command, in this case, a relatively short chain of command from the battalion up to the president. So that one kind of actually jumps first to mind. And then I think just in a different context, the chain of command information with the Philippines is really beneficial for understanding and focusing the investigation on certain areas of where the killings were happening and the units, and police stations and commanders responsible for it. So in some ways it was at the start of the investigation rather than the end to help kind of focus the actual on-the-ground reporting and talking to victims and other interviews like that.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so a brief question for Christina, and then I'll pass back over to Dennis. But do you think that any progress has been made in recent years in taking sexual violence in war and conflict more seriously by journalists and editors in particular?
Well, yes, I'm happy to say that there is. I think Ukraine, it's hard to say there's anything positive about that war, but this is a grim positive, I suppose, that there has, for the first time that I've ever seen, been widespread reporting of the use of sexual violence in that war. Most media have covered it. It's been spoken about by lots of different international leaders and organizations. President Zelensky has talked about it, and talked about it not as a side issue, which is what normally happens at the end of the war, but in the same breath as talking about the killing and torture. So I think that that's really important. And, you have to grit your teeth a bit and think, have people taken it more seriously because it was in Europe? But we take what we can get. So if the fact that there's been more reporting on it there means that people now are more aware of it in other places, and that maybe something will be done. However, having said all that, for all of the coverage and discussion, the prosecutor's office in Ukraine tell me that they've actually received hardly any funding, and they have very few war crimes investigators able to look at this, and in fact look at I think they're investigating something like 90,000 war crimes in general. So but I think things have changed, and that's good. And also I think it's also because there are far more female correspondents than there used to be.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. And unfortunately, I don't have much time. I'll just say before we close to thank the Global Investigative Journalism Network, the reporting network, and our audience today. And a very big thank you to our speakers, Claire, Sam, Tony, and Christina. And I'll just finally be sure to watch the Global Investigative Journalism Network Twitter's feed, which is at GIJN, and with their website for details on future events. Thank you and goodbye.